he can be seen as a regular panelist on NPR's Wait, Don't Tell Me, the quiz show. And because he strives to be diverse, he's also done some work for Garden and Gun, which he claims is the best title ever for a publication. I think he's there because they promised that they really will let him write something on chainsaw gardening. I saw on a website last week that P.J. O'Rourke has more citations in the Penguin Dictionary of Humorous Quotations than any other living writer. I tried to choose my favorite to share with you today, but there were so many. I settled on one that I think is both relevant and true. PJ says that, quote, "Feeling good about government is like looking on the bright side of any catastrophe. When you quit looking on the bright side, the catastrophe is still there." There isn't much that happens on a daily basis that P.J. O'Rourke hasn't considered, cogitated, or communicated about. He has established himself as America's premier political satirist. He informs and entertains and has proven himself to be a savvy guide to national and world affairs. In this new book, he walks us through stories of a typical boomer childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, as one reviewer put it, turning a keen eye on himself and his 75 million accomplices in making America what it is today. He writes about the way the post-war generation somehow came of age by never quite growing up and created a better society by turning society upside down. His publisher calls it an hilarious attempt to understand his generation's messy hilarity and a celebration of the mess the baby boom has made. In the book, PJ talks about what boomers really hold dear by stating that baby boomers are not power hungry. Power comes with that kicker, responsibility. We're greedy for love, happiness, experience, sensation, thrills, praise, fame, adulation, inner peace, and as it turns out, money. Health and fitness too, but we're not greedy for power. Observe the baby boomers who have climbed to its ascendancy in Washington. The best and the brightest, they're over at Goldman Sachs. And on boomer progeny, he says, there are some things the baby boom has done that we're not proud of. We've used up all the weird. It has always been the special prerogative of youth to look and act strange, to alarm and surprise their elders with peculiar dress and manners. The baby boom exhausted the available supply of peculiar. Weird clothes, we wore them. Weird beards, we grew them. Weird words and phrases, we said them. Weird attitudes, we had them. Thus, when it came time for the next generation to alarm and surprise us with their peculiarities, they were compelled to pierce their extremities and permanently ink their exposed flesh. That must have hurt. We apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce that somewhat peculiar, maybe a little weird, but definitely one of the best and brightest, Mr. P.J. O'Rourke.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming out for this, which is, you know, a little daunted about speaking about this subject in this place, because here we are in one of the most extraordinary monuments to one of the most extraordinary men in one of the most extraordinary generations. This is a monument to the greatest generation and all that the greatest generation accomplished. And I sort of feel like I'm up here as a representative of the not-so-hot-so generation, you know, that followed immediately after. And I think, well, in one sense, it is appropriate to speak here at the Reagan Library, because it was Ronald Reagan who, and his generation, who made the baby boom who they were in two important senses. They gave us two moments of confidence and of, you know, which we may have abused, but nonetheless, you know, it's always good to have two moments of confidence and faith and belief in our country and ourselves. We were born right after World War II into an America that was the richest, most powerful, most influential country in the world. And that remained true for a long time. It remained true until some of the errors of the Vietnam War began to undercut it, and Arab oil embargo and things like that. It remained true for 15, 18, 20 years. And then we went through a period when we were not so powerful, not so influential, maybe even not so rich. A pretty grim period that, and I'm sure the people in this audience remember quite well. We call it the Carter administration. And along came that greatest generation. Here they came, back again, riding back out of the sunset. Not a kid, no longer young, to give us a second chance at being the children of the most important, most influential, richest, most confident country in the world. So we have a lot to thank that generation for, and the way we acted wasn't, as I say, the baby boom wasn't my fault, but it really wasn't their fault. They meant well. If we didn't always turn out so well, that was. Now we talked a little bit about self, which is the baby boom's significant obsession with self. Now I say that's not because we're a selfish generation, because selfish, that means too concerned with the self. And we're not. Self isn't something we're just concerned with. We are self. And before us, self was without form and void, like our parents in their dumpy clothes and vague ideas, And then we came along, and now the personal is the political, the personal is the socioeconomic, the personal is the religious and the secular, the science and the arts. The personal is everything that creepeth upon the earth under his, and let us hasten to add, her kind. If the baby boom has done one thing, is to beget a personal universe, and our apologies for anyone who turned out to be personally a jerk. That did happen. See, because self is like fish, proverbially speaking. I mean, give a man a fish and you have fed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, and if he turns into a dry fly catch and release angling fanatic up to his liver in icy water, pestering trout with 3-pound test line on a $1,000 graphic rod, a graphite rod, well, at least his life partner is glad to have him out of the house. So here we are in the baby boom cosmos, formed in our image, personally tailored to our individual needs, and predetermined to be eternally fresh and novel, and we saw that it was good, or pretty good. I mean, we should have had a cooler name. There's no, like the Lost generation did, and that would have been better. Except good luck to anybody who tries to tell us to get lost. But anyway, it's too late. We're stuck with being described as exploding infants, and maybe it is time, now that we have splattered ourselves all over the place, for the baby boom to look back and think, what made us who we are? What caused us to act the way we do? And as the kids put it these days, WTF. Because the truth is, if we hadn't decided to be young forever, we would be old. This year, 2014, the youngest baby boomers, born in the last year when anybody thought it was hip to like Lyndon Johnson, this year, the youngest of us turned 50. We would be sad about getting old if we weren't too busy remarrying younger wives, reviving careers that hit glass ceilings when children arrived, and renewing prescription drugs that keep us from being sad. And we'll never retire. We can't. The mortgage is underwater. We're up to debt to the Rogaine for the kids' college education, and it serves us right, because we're the generation who insisted that a passion for living should replace working for one. Still, it is, I think, an appropriate moment for us to weigh what we have wrought and tally what we have added to and subtracted from existence. We've reached the age of accountability. The world is our fault. We are the generation that has an excuse for everything, one of our greatest contributions to modern life, in my opinion. But the world is still our fault, and it's just a matter of power and privileged demography. Whenever anything happens anywhere, somebody over 50 signs the bill for it, you know. And the baby boom, seated as we are at the head of life's table, is hearing Generation X and Generation Y and the millennials all saying, check, please. But you know, I had a little problem with this book, and the problem was the sheer size of the baby boom. 75, 76 million people. To address all of America's baby boom is to face big, broad problems because of our sheer numbers and diversity. I mean, and not only are we diverse, but we take a sort of thorny pride in our every deviation from the norm, even when we're in therapy for it, you know. We are all alike in that we each think that we're unusual, you know. Now, fortunately, we are all alike in our approach to big, broad problems. We won't face them. There's a website for that, a support group to join, a class to take, alternative medicine, regular exercise, a book that explains it all, a celebrity on TV who's been through the same thing, or we can eliminate gluten from our diet. History is full of generations that had too many problems. We are the first generation to have too many answers, which is not a problem. You know, if you consider the people who have faced up squarely to the deepest and most perplexing conundrums of existence, Leo Tolstoy, just for example. Leo Tolstoy, he tackled every one of these things. Why are we here? What kind of life should we lead? The nature of evil, the character of love, the essence of identity, salvation, suffering, death. And what did it get him? Dead, for one thing, you know, and off his rocker for the last 30 years of his life, as a matter of fact. Plus, he was saddled with this 1,000-page novel about war and peace and everything else you can think of, which he couldn't even look up on Wikipedia because he hadn't written it yet, you know. What a life. You know, if Leo Tolstoy had been one of us baby boomers, he could have entered a triathlon, you know, a baby boom innovation of the middle 1970s. You see, triathlon, it's by the middle 70s, we knew we couldn't run away from our problems, but if we added cycling and swimming. So, to the problems of talking about the baby boom, let us turn our big, broad, yet soon to be firmed up, thanks to the triathlon for seniors that we're planning to enter, generational backsides. However, a difficulty remains. You know, most groups of people who get tagged by history as a generation, they can be described in an easy, offhand way. They're folks sort of the same age, experiencing sort of the same things in sort of the same place, like, you know, the cast of Seinfeld, you know, or Friends, you know. And, you know, like I am, because I took modern literature in college, I'm pretty sure that Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, Henry Miller, Ezra Pound were all roommates in a big apartment on the left bank in Paris during the 1920s. You know, if that doesn't happen to be true, I give the idea free to you for a sitcom. But unlike most generations, such as the lost generation, the baby boom actually has an exact definition. An exact demographic definition. We're the children who were born during a period after World War II when the long-term trend in fertility among American women was exceeded. The excess began promptly in 1946 when all the guys got home from overseas, and it kind of gradually tapered off until in 1964 American women were taking the pill or rolling over and pretending to be asleep or telling their husbands to go phone the Pope about where to buy rubbers. You know. 46 to 64, this is a long time, you know, and And distinctions among different kinds of baby boomers within that huge group, they need to be made. Now, geographical distinctions, they really don't work for us. We're too peripatetic, a generation for that. Spent much too much time moving around. Distinctions according to race, class, gender, or sexual orientation, that would be offensive. Any of those would be offensive to baby boom sensitivities. Furthermore, they would be pretty much beside the point for me trying to write this book, because as much as I would like to be as different from everyone else as a good member of the baby boom is supposed to be, I'm not. I happen to be hopelessly ordinary in matters of race, class, gender identification, and which section of Playboy I turned to first when I was 16. But time is a distinction that we all have to endure. And so what I ended up doing in the book was I sorted the baby boom by age. I sorted it not just by age, but I thought, well, heck, we're the generation that will never grow up. We're never going to grow up. So I decided to sort us by high school classes, basically. In the senior class, I belong to the senior class. I was born in 1947. We were born in the late 40s. And we were we were on the bow wave of the baby boom's voyage of exploration, and yet at the same time we were also quite closely tethered in the wake of the preceding generation. So that what happened in effect was that the senior class of the baby boom, we were keel-hauled, you know, dragged under the boat, you know, and left a bit soggy and shaken, you know. So if we wound up as financial advisors trying to wear tongue studs, or as, you know, Trotskyites trying to organize Tea Party protests, or both, you know, we are to be forgiven. I guess really I can explain the senior class of the baby boom best by saying that Hillary Clinton and Cheech Marin of Cheech and Chong are both members of the baby boom senior class. You see that. Now the junior class, they were born in the early 50s. They were often the younger siblings of the senior class. And they came of age when our parents were just like throwing in the towel. Our parents were like just giving up on that what's the matter with kids today screaming match at the dinner table, you know. And so the junior class, born in the early 50s, they ended up pursuing sort of the notions, the whims, and the fancies of the baby boom with an even greater intensity. I mean, for them, drugs were no longer experimental. Drugs were proven, you know. I mean, John Belushi was a member of the junior class. Actually, he was born in 1949, but I knew John, and I'm sure he was held back a couple of years, and so we count him as a member of the junior class. It was the junior class of the baby boom. They really were the teeny boppers, the groupies, the barefoot urchins of Haight-Ashbury. Now, they hunted up some shoes when they eventually made their way to Silicon Valley. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were both born in 1955. But you'll notice they never did find their neckties. So, now, the sophomores are interesting because they're born in the late 1950s. And by the time they reached adolescence, the baby boom ethos had pretty much permeated society. In the sophomore class of the baby boom, they gladly accepted sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you know, and the deep philosophical underpinnings thereof. But they'd seen enough of the baby boom in action to realize that what works in general terms doesn't always work when the bong sets fire to the beanbag chair. So they were a little more cautious. In college, many of the sophomore class, many of them attended classes. Some even sneaked off and got MBAs. The Preppy Handbook is written by the sophomore class of the baby boom. Now, the freshmen are, to me, the most interesting of all, in a way. Born in the early 1960s, and of course our president and the first lady are both members of the freshman class of the baby boom. And what's interesting to me about the freshmen is that they felt no visceral effects from the events that formed the baby boom. I mean, Vietnam War, to the freshman baby boomers, the Vietnam War was just something, when they were little kids, it was just inexplicably on TV all the time, like Ed McMahon, you know, who knew what it was, you know. Feminism had gone from a pressing social issue to Maude, you know, a Bea Arthur TV comedy show that their parents liked, you know. Martin Luther King was a day off from work. I mean, they just didn't see any of this stuff. And the best example of this to me was the kerfluffle during President Obama's first campaign about the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. I'm sure many of you remember the sort of scandal involving Reverend Wright. Reverend Wright was the pastor at the church that the Obamas went to, and he was, you may recall, a man of forceful views, forcefully put. God D-word America, CIA invented AIDS to kill dark-skinned people, things like that. And so Republicans and conservatives and Fox News and whoever, we're all on top of this, totally on top of this. I mean, here is this man who married the Obamas, baptized their children, was the preacher at their church, saying these outrageous things. And the thing that came out of that scandal was nothing. I mean, it basically turned out, yes, President Obama had been there, but he hadn't been listening at all, and paying no attention whatsoever to this. He was like in the back pew, blackberrying to Rahm Emanuel, Went right over his head. And I'm thinking, boy, this is the difference between the parts of the baby boom. The senior class of the baby boom, guys my age, if we'd been back there with the Reverend Wright, we'd been standing on the pew, the fist up in the air, yelling right on and calling for property damage over at nearby University of Chicago, And the the junior baby boomers, the next class down, junior baby boomers, assuming they were awake in time to go to church and assuming they could find the church, would have been sitting there basically nodding in stoned agreement and hoping that the church's social outreach program included free lunch. Now the sophomore baby boomers, they would have been, a little skeptical about it. They go, I don't know, Reverend Wright, I think that's pitching it a little high and inside there, But like freshman baby boomers, this is the way the world always has been. BS. We live in a sea of BS. We're fish that no more know that there's anything other than that. We're fish in the BS. That's our universe. We don't know there's air. We don't know there's land. It just went right completely over the top of his head. Interesting. And now, of course, we're at the moment when the baby boom is the world's future. The world's future. Because everyone on the planet is, if we're lucky, everyone on the planet is going to turn into the baby boom eventually. For the very simple reason is, what made the baby boom? What made the baby boom? I actually did a little research on this. And what made the baby boom different from the greatest generation? If you had to put like 2 words on it, 3 words, I guess, $10,000. $10,000. Growing up, baby boom had median family income, not average, which can be skewed by top and bottom, but median, half above, half below. Median family income, $10,000 more than the greatest generation did. 10,000 inflation-adjusted dollars, 10,000 real dollars. What makes us different from our parents is $10,000. And not only that, but when the baby boom was growing up, we were growing up in this period of steady, smooth economic growth. Period of economic growth in America that lasted from right after World War II all the way to the Arab oil embargo with only a couple of little blips in between. You look at the economic background of the greatest generation and what you will see is that their family incomes went up, they went down, they went way up, into the 20s, and then they went way down into depression. So much so that their best year was only a couple of years from their worst year. So if you put together simple size of the way we grew up, the economic size of the way we grew up, plus the stability of the way we in the baby boom grow up, you get a very different experiment. And then there was another part of the social experiment going on after World War II. Parents had been through the Depression. Parents had been through the war. Parents were ready for a breather. You know, they wanted a calm life. Nice, calm, quiet, Levittown life was just fine with them. You know, Levittown may look boring to us. If you've been to Guadalcanal, not so much so. You know, just fine. You know? So our parents led this very stable life. They stayed together. They stayed married, you know. We had two parents. We had this stable American society that had been through a lot and didn't feel like going through anything else. And so there was this huge social experiment that went on that created the baby boom. And with luck, the rest of the world is going to have that same social experiment. So eventually, the rest of the world is they're going to turn into us, you know, as soon as families get too happy, you know, and too prosperous and start feeling, you know, too much affection for their children and being too permissive with them, you know. Now, of course, maybe that won't happen, you know. I mean, maybe the baby boom, extravagant freedom and scant responsibility and plenty of money and a modicum of peace, maybe that's going to lead to such a high rate of carbon emissions that we will all fry or drown or freeze. I can't keep up with this, you know. I'm not a climate denier, you know, but on the other hand, they keep changing the terms. It was climate warming for a while, and then it got minus 30 in Minnesota, you know. So now it's climate change. Basically anything that happens, so every time the weather happens, you know, we did it, you know, by driving our car. But anyway, can't have everything, and you can have a profusion of opportunity and at the same time a collapse of traditional social standards, which is what the baby boom represents, collapse of traditional social standard. And if you look at at Western Europe and at the wealthiest parts of Asia and Latin America, you will see that same collapse. Those folks, they are almost as useless as we are. And I mean useless in a good sense. I mean useless in a good sense, you know, abundant disposable income, ample leisure time to devote to pointless activities that don't harm anybody except ourselves, you know, not a lot of Nazis and commies running around, you know, and not a lot of fanaticism, just, you know, the baby boom. And baby boom places, incidentally, politically, this kind of interests me, is that they all seem to be engaged in that same sort of national political deadlock that we find ourselves here in this country. And, you know, a lot of the pundit types are always tutting this political deadlock. But I'm thinking, okay, go back to the history of the 20th century. There are worse things than political deadlock, you know? What about when Germany was always all marching in lockstep and they invaded Poland? You know, they weren't deadlocked. You know, Japanese, they bombed Pearl Harbor. That wasn't deadlock. You know, that was like forceful political action. You know, I'm even thinking back to the Bay of Tonkin resolution when Lyndon Johnson was basically given a free rein in Vietnam. I think 2 senators voted against that, and no one voted against it in the House of Representatives. Wasn't any deadlock there, but there should have been, you know. So there are worse things in the world than deadlock. I foresee a day when noxious politics, they're going to disappear. They're going to disappear because what's going to happen is all the world political science classes, they're going to degenerate into these hour-long shouting matches like my political science classes did back in the 1960s. And I think that was great that we had these shouting matches. What I don't remember, of course, is what we were shouting about. Because like the professors were opposed to the war in Vietnam, the students were opposed to the war in Vietnam, and we were all shouting at each other about how opposed we were to the war in Vietnam. Go figure. But I do think that it's hard for politics to remain truly noxious when people like being obnoxious better, you know, and we certainly seem to have that figured out in Congress, you know. Now, stupid notions of central planning, of nationalization, protectionist trade barriers, these are going to fall by the wayside when everybody is asleep in Econ 101 like I was, you know. I mean, part of the secret to the enormous economic expansion under the baby boom, tremendous technological innovation, and a huge lowering of the rate of world poverty is that we don't know a damn thing about economics, you know. I mean, we just, you know, buy what we want to buy and, you know, whatever, try and pay for it later, you know. Sooner or later, you know, there are almost 1.3 billion people, almost 1.3 billion people in this world who are making $1.25 a day or less. They're living off $1.25 a day. The way I was when I was selling pot, so I smoked up all the profits. But you know, they're going to figure out that 1.3 billion people, they are going to figure out that there is a better way. And in fact, I just received an email from Nigeria about rather large amount of money, you know, needing to be transferred to an American bank with requiring only modest assistance on my part, you know. There will be no religious fanaticism in a baby boom world, because we are not a generation who listens to anybody, God included, you know? And in our defense, I doubt that God minds us not bothering about him. Because very few of the people that we have bothered, parents, college deans, the police, LBJ, you know, attractive types in bars, very few of them have minded when we quit bothering them. And so I'm figuring God is on board with that. Now, we're not going to have world peace. World peace is too much to ask. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to assemble those huge conscripted armies that used to fight gigantic wars, because everybody is going to have a letter from his doctor about how he's allergic to camouflage, you know. And besides, this is, you know, brings us back to what Joanne was saying about power. That's just not, power is not what the baby boom is about. For a very simple reason. It comes with that kicker, responsibility. In order to take power, you have to take responsibility. And so my message, and I think the message of the baby boom, really, the message to all the tyrannical, despotic, overbearing squares with their two-bit autocracies at the butt ends of the world, my message to them is that you're going to turn into baby boomers too, you know. I mean, it's going to rain on your Woodstock, you know. You're going to spend your treasure on disco, cocaine, and rehab, you know. I mean, your junk bonds shall default and your dot-com bubble shall burst, and you shall form overage garage bands and try and play Margaritaville. Your third spouse shall acquire an American Express black card with a credit limit higher than the U.S. national debt. Your daughters shall wear nose rings. Your sons shall have pagan symbols indelibly marked upon their necks. Unless, of course, you belong to one of those cultures where daughters do wear nose rings and sons do have pagan symbols indelibly marked upon their necks, in which case they shall not, you know. You shall be perplexed by the internet. You shall grow old and addled enough to vote for Ron Paul in a presidential primary. There is just no escape from happiness, from attention, from affection, from freedom, from irresponsibility, from money, from peace, from opportunity, and from deciding that everything you were ever told is BS. And so I say to the world, behold the baby boom, ye mighty, and despair. Now, that's everything that I know. However, if anybody would like to ask a question, we've got a microphone. We have a roaming microphone.
We do have a microphone, and please don't ask the question until you have the microphone, because we are taping this. So
right, you have to have the speaking stick.
I'm sure we have a baby boomer in here, right?
But if any, so I'll make up some other stuff if anybody has some questions.
Right here.
You can go ahead, sir. Hi. What do you think is the most interesting thing happening today?
The most interesting thing happening today is world prosperity. It really is. I mean, probably the most interesting thing is India and China. Now, it's going to have its ups and downs. It's not going to be pretty any more than our industrial revolution back in the early 19th century was pretty. I mean, everybody thinks, oh, that was a wonderful leap forward for mankind, but if you go read your Blake, Dark Satanic Mills, and it's always got its downside. With us, it'll be climate change, you know, more winters like this one. But the fact that a couple of billion people, you know, something like 2/5 of the population of the world are moving into the middle class. This changes things radically. And who will be next? You know, probably not the Russians, to judge by the Sochi hotel rooms. But, you know, one of these days, Africa is going to take off too. That's another very populous country with a tremendous amount of resources that, like India and China, has been hindered for all these years by really rotten governance. One of these days, that's going to change. Maybe it won't be soon. But, you know, a lot of the world moving toward a middle-class existence just changes the whole political landscape. It's like trying to imagine the EU getting into World War I. First place, they'd have to have committee meetings that would last years. I mean, you know, years and years. You know, they'd have to have conferences and committee meetings and white papers and all this kind of stuff. And by then, it'd be 1918, and the thing would be over. You know. And the other thing is that, like, you know, half the people, you know, in these countries aren't even from those countries. You know, I mean, so it's how are you going to get this kind of like insane nationalism that led to World War I and by extension to World War II? Who feels nationalistic about the EU, you know? I mean, I pledge allegiance to the EU for what, you know, like cheese regulations? You know? So it's just, you know, this movement into prosperity changes the world.
I think we have somebody over here.
How do you explain the declining middle class in the United States? And do you feel that democracy can survive with a diminished middle class?
I think a diminished middle class is a very dangerous thing to have happen. We have been through it before. That's really what the Depression was. In fact, it was probably a worse shock then than it is now, because the 20s and the industrializing period of World War I were when a tremendous number of people in America moved into the middle class who had previously been poor farmers or had been grossly underpaid laborers. Huge number of Americans moved into the middle class in the 20s, and then in 1929 found all their gains wiped out suddenly. I mean, you know, their hopes had been raised for a dozen, 15 years, and then just dashed, whereas what we're going through now is a more gradual process. I don't think it's going to end up happening. I don't think we're going to end up losing our middle class, but not until we have gone through some very painful periods. We are right now in the middle of a technological revolution that is every bit as dramatic and as exciting and as important as the industrial revolution, as the original industrial revolution, the electronic revolution. But what it's always important to remember about these revolutionary developments in society is that they are extremely disturbing to society. They cause a tremendous amount of chaos. They cause a tremendous amount of problems when they happen. And also, lots of things that they set out to do don't work out. You know, I mean, it is like the dot-com bubble. I mean, when railroads first came along, they were building railroads everywhere. They forgot that railroads had to go someplace, you know, that there had to be people and things that needed to get there. They would just build a railroad, you know. And, of course, a lot of them, you know, there actually was a big, severe recession in the United States in the 19th century based on railroads going bust because people had gotten over-enthusiastic about the. Think of all the automobile companies that were started and how many of them are left, you know. I mean, you see, you know, just when we need a Baker Electric, you know, where is that company? It's gone, you know. So it's very major technological changes, and we really haven't seen one. We haven't seen a major technological change since the early 19th century, which means nobody in this room has seen it at all, you know, not even those of us who are old were around for that one. So major technological changes of any kind are exceedingly disruptive. It's going to be painful to get through this, but we will get through it. And in the end, we will have, I think we're a fundamentally middle-class country. Fundamentally middle-class country because we don't like being poor, so that's out. And we're a fundamentally middle-class country because when it comes to investing, we stink, and so we never really get rich. So I think we will endure.
We had somebody over here in the front row.
Talk for a minute, if you will, about covering wars for Rolling Stone magazine.
Oh, yeah, it was, I did spend a long time doing this from the Civil War, not that old, Civil War in Lebanon, Civil War in Lebanon, 1983, until the Iraq War. I spent a lot of time covering wars. And what was always interesting to me about covering wars, first place, it's not as dangerous as it seems like they do it, because you may have seen movies about war correspondents, and in those movies, war correspondents stand up. Never happens. We're totally down there under the podium, especially if you're a print guy, you know, I mean, you got no reason not to duck, you know. And so one time, it's during the Bosnian War, I was down in a place called Slavonski Brod. And Slavonski Brod was on three sides, had Serbs on three sides who were shelling the city. And the mayor of Slavonski Brod was very, very angry because Sarajevo was getting all the attention. And he had basically gotten us down there, a bunch of us reporters down there, to bawl us out for the fact that we weren't covering Slavonski Brod. And we tried to explain to him that, you know, part of it is just, it's a dramatic presentation. Surrounded on three sides versus surrounded on four sides. Four sides sells, you know, three sides you could leave. You know, he didn't really seem to get that. Anyway, we're in a conference in downtown Slavonski Brod, and there's like some artillery shells are coming in and stuff. And I have to leave the conference, go to the bathroom, and it's one of these like giant old sort of Soviet-style bathrooms with a tank way up there and a big long chain on the tank, you know. And so I finish what I'm doing. I pull the chain on the tank, and I come out of the bathroom, and everybody is hiding under the table. And what I didn't realize, this toilet was so loud that I did not hear the shell go off in the street, you know. So I come out into this room with everybody hiding under the table. I said, yeah, I just took a leak, you know. It's okay. But the main thing about covering wars is that we so rarely back here have any understanding of who is fighting who and why. And I always figured that was my main job. My main job was not to cover whether the fighting, who was winning, who was losing, not to cover the tragedy. There's always plenty of that, you know, the plenty of innocent people get you know, killed and so on. Not to cover that. This is to give to some people some idea of who was fighting who and why. And I did this not only with the with wars, but with other conflicts, like when Marcos was being overthrown. Who was for Marcos? You know, you think Marcos came across as such a pig in the U.S. press, you're going like, well, he should be out any minute now, you know? But there were people in the Philippines who supported Marcos. Why? You know, so I went out in the countryside, you know, to talk about that. I wish somebody would do this for me about Thailand. Any of you have any idea what's going on in Thailand? They're really, really mad at each other, and who knows why, and boy, they can't spell their last names. You know? So if I were still doing this, that would be right where I would be headed, and the reason would be I'd say, okay, the red shirts want this, and they belong to that, and they live in this part of the country, and you know, the people who are currently in power live in the other part of the country, and this is what the fracas is about. So I just felt that was my main job. It was actually, I tell you a little story about this. There was what I felt I was doing in the Yiddish theater in New York. In the early part of the 20th century, many of the people in the audience not only didn't speak English, I mean, which was why the Yiddish theater was in Yiddish, but they were country people from Russia and Poland, and they really didn't have much experience of the whole theatrical thing. And so what in the Yiddish theater, there was a character called Jake the Explainer. And Jake the Explainer would stand down on the corner of the stage while the play was going on. And he would talk to some of the less sophisticated people in the audience. And he would say, you see, you know, they have a beautiful daughter. They want her to marry the rabbi's son, but she's in love with the soldier, you know. And that's what, and Jake the Explainer would stand down there and explain things, you know. And I always figured that was basically my role as a reporter, was to be Jake the Explainer, you know.
Okay, I'm not Joanne the Explainer, but we have.
Hi, thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
I am of the younger end of the, I guess I would be a freshman. I'm 50 this year. So
Yep.
I grew up the youngest of 5 reading hand-me-down copies of National Lampoon. And
The ones that belonged to your older brother that your mother didn't find and throw out,
yeah,
right?
yeah, I had to search for them. So growing up in Southern California, I was very much imbued with self, and I wanted to make money, and I wanted to buy the cool sports car everybody drove, and I saved my money, and I eventually did it. And I bought a 42-year-old, quote, ass-engined Nazi slot car. And I'm just curious if you've properly apologized for that comment, and if you ever get any mail about our favorite old Porsche.
I was doing a story, this takes a little background here. I was doing a story many, many years ago, 1978, I think, like 79. I was driving a Ferrari across country, not mine, but it was a Ferrari for car and driver. They had me doing a piece driving a Ferrari across country. And I guess it was one of the great moments in my work life, because I had a full-time job. I was editor of the National Lampoon. And I went into my boss, corporate guy, president of the corporation, and I said, Adrian, I said, look, you know, I know we're behind. We got a deadline to meet here, and I know we got all sorts of, you know, problems going on here in the company. And I know, and it's, you know, the holidays are coming up, and I know this is a really inappropriate time for me to ask for some time off, but Car and Driver has offered to loan me this Ferrari to drive across the country. And my boss looked at me and he said, can I come too? So I took off with my boss across country. And we encountered, as we were speeding across Georgia at about 140 miles an hour, we encountered one of those whale tail Porsches of the era. And in my story, I called it an ass-engine Nazi slot car. I now own one. Not the whale tail. I never could really figure out the whale tail. I don't know what that was going. But I own a 1990 911, and I have come around. And as a matter of fact, I had to publicly apologize just this year, just this last year, because 2013 was the 50th anniversary of the Porsche 911, and so I had to write an apology in Car and Driver for what I said. I do love the car, and that Ferrari broke down every single day. So.
We have somebody right here.
Given the landscape of the baby boomers in the 4 classes, how do you see that impact as this group ages politically, and how can we persuade them to be maybe a little more conservative and vote in somebody a little more conservative?
One of the puzzles to me about the baby boom is its politics. And it's not so much that the baby boom isn't conservative. You can sort of understand that, because baby boomers, especially the older baby boomers, tend to blame conservatives for Vietnam, tend to blame conservatives for marijuana being illegal, tend to blame conservatives for having racist and gender and all sorts of other prejudices. So it might be too much to ask the baby boom to be conservative, but wouldn't you expect that the baby boom would be libertarian? I mean, we were all so liberated, you know, and the only reason I think that we're not libertarian is that we did and do what, as libertarians urge us to do, we did anything we wanted, and we scared ourselves badly. You know? Whoa, I don't think we'll do that again. The other thing is that we're the generation that never grew up. So when we look at our kids, we know exactly what they're thinking, you know? I think our parents had no idea. Somebody said it's the difference between a helicopter parent. We're the helicopter parents. Our parents were the drone parents. You know, they were pretty far away most of the time, and every now and then they'd whack you. But we were right there. We knew what our kids were up to, and so we were right there on top of it, and it kind of undercut. But when it comes to the baby boom politics, I think we suffer from a condition that is very common in a modern, large, elaborate, modern welfare state. Everybody in a democracy, in a modern democracy, to a greater or a lesser extent, lives in a kind of welfare state. And there is always a split, usually a pretty even divide, between people who want the government to provide more social services to be paid for by other people and the other people, you know? And I'm guessing most of the people in this room fit into the other people category, you know? But in fairness, like, I get confused myself, you know? I'll be 66 this year. I'm on Medicare. I mean, you know, some days I'm a Medicare Plan D, medications recipient, aid recipient. And some days it's April 15th. You know, so I can get mixed up myself about which half I belong to, you know. And I think this is going to be a natural continuing, kind of a permanent state of debate. And what generally determines a change in this is, like, the liberals will get an upper hand, and as they have with something like Obamacare, and it doesn't work, and it costs a fortune, you know. Now, then the conservatives will get the upper hand, and of course they can't get rid of Obamacare, because once you have an entitlement, you can't get rid of it. But maybe they can make it, scale it back, or make it more sensible, or cut down the benefits, or something like that. And so this is going to go back and forth. We've watched this in Europe, and even some very, very liberal countries in Europe have managed to cut their benefits and you know, cut the. So this is just, I think, this is just going to be the ongoing state of democracy. You know, that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep fighting the good fight. That is extremely important. But I do think we should face that this is a fight that's not going to go away.
We have time for one final question.
I've had the good fortune recently to speak to a couple of high schools, 500 kids, 400 kids, about leadership. And what has surprised me is how optimistic these kids are today and what great dreams they have. It reminds me of how I felt when Kennedy came along, Reagan came along, and created that new sense of hope for the future. Do you get in contact with colleges, and what's your sense of that kind of pent-up optimism that kids are looking for?
I agree. I totally agree. You know, kids may realize, I think most wise kids at the moment do, realize that these are economically difficult times and that they're going to have like a little bit of an economic struggle. But I do think they're fundamentally optimistic. I think that the current crop of kids, and by kids I mean anybody under 50, have taken the good things from the baby boom, the self-confidence, the willingness to try anything, the willingness to take risks, and they've taken that part to heart, and they've kind of let go of the stupider part of the baby boom, the willingness to take any risk, you know, whatsoever. The screaming and the yelling that we did are just sort of gut anti-establishmentarianism. They don't seem to have that. They seem to be a more sensible version, but they've also taken from us a kinder, gentler generation. I mean, we are a kinder and gentler generation than the generation that preceded us. And every man, at least, and probably some of the women too, in this audience can remember a time when you could not go to a bar on any given night, a nice bar, I don't mean a dive bar, just a regular bar, and a fight didn't break out. I mean, it was just standard operating procedure. Like one night out of 3, somebody be out, smack somebody else in the nose about something else, or take it outside, or whatever, screaming and yelling. You don't see that with our generation. You know, we like to yell at each other, but it just never raises to that level of violence. We are, you know, much more inclined to give the world a hug and a drug, you know, than to punch people in the nose. And you know, I'm very impressed with the kids that I meet. And of course, to them, stuff that's quite confusing to us, all this rapidly changing world of mysteriously named apps, you know, that I haven't the slightest idea, you know, I don't know Snapchat from a Post-it note, you know, I mean, but to them, all this stuff is really exciting. You know, we invented it, you know, but we didn't know what it meant, really, you know. To them, this is like just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful world, and I do think they're optimistic about it, and I think they're good kids, I really do.
Thank you.